Last time I had the privilege of preaching, I talked about how the value of things as assessed by our human eyes can be deceiving. Today, I hope we can look at what appears to be just a little story and have our eyes open to see more of what God sees in it and in our own lives in this world. I pray that together we might be reoriented to the awesomeness of God, a posture and awareness that is the beginning of not just wisdom, as we heard in our psalm today, but also healing and liberation from the bad spirits we may find ourselves in during these continually challenging days. Today's gospel on the surface seems like a straightforward little story, but the Gospel of Mark is carefully crafted, and beneath the surface is one of the most dramatic examples of a literary pattern called a chiasm in all of the New Testament. Named for the Greek letter X, a chiasm is a particular structure that helps an oral storyteller remember the story, but also emphasizes certain points. It's a pattern like this: A, B, C, D, and then moving back out again, C, B, A. Let's see how this works in Mark as we remember together the story. Jesus comes into the synagogue. Jesus teaches with authority, and this is acknowledged with amazement by those present. A man with an unclean spirit cries out. Jesus heals the demoniac. The unclean spirit cries out and leaves the man. People acknowledge Jesus' authority with amazement. Jesus leaves the synagogue. Now, there are many ways of thinking about what this kind of pattern does or reveals to us as readers, but I want to focus on the most basic function. We are given the central moment, the crux of the matter, the most important thing to know and remember in the center of the chiasm of the X. But most of us probably could have said that Jesus healing a man by casting out the bad spirit was the center of the story without noticing this pattern. So I think it's more interesting in some ways to look at the inverse gift, the one that matches our psalm for today. And that, for me, is the attention that this intentional structure draws to what surrounds the act of Jesus' healing. And that, today, is that Jesus' authority is recognized, even if it's with awe and wonder and shock and some confusion. His teachings are responded to with amazement. The heart of the matter is still Jesus acting to remove that which opposes God's goodness and abundant life, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a house of worship, on the Sabbath day, where there is reverence, even again if it's confused and awestruck reverence for Jesus' authority. This exorcism in Mark, the very first action Jesus takes beyond preaching, teaching, and calling the disciples, is sometimes called a miracle. And it takes place in the soil of reverence for Christ's authority. It makes me wonder about what other miracles, unexpected transformations might come to bloom when the soil of reverence and awe for Christ's authority is cultivated. What happens in our hearts and lives when we hear anew that the goodness of the reign of God is within reach, that God, just like in Jesus' baptism, has torn open the heavens and torn through the temple curtain, as in the crucifixion, and is alive and on the loose in the risen Christ, promising to be with us always to the end of the age. This is the pulsing heart of the Gospel of Mark and Jesus' good news in it. When you trust the good news, what bad spirit is cast out in you? But this story and its intentional structure also raise the ever important question, ever present to us: how do we actually respond to Jesus and his teachings. We see two ways, two faces held up as possible. It seems from this story, it is not enough to recognize Jesus. Even the demons do that. But what do we do? How do we feel? What do we say when we look at Jesus? Listen to him. There is the possibility of awe, fear, wonder, amazement, acknowledgement of his authority. We see this in the crowd, in those present. But there is also the possibility of snarling defiance and nonchalance, the voice that says, I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth, but what do you have to do with me? Have you come to destroy us? We hear those voices today too. Naming the demons is an important first step in casting them out with Christ's power. And one writer talks about how the biggest, most common bad spirit of all might be named simply unbelief with a capital U. One that can be recognized when we see that we are losing our faith, our trust in God, in life itself as a sacred force, and in our fellow human beings. The demon unbelief might be known most palpably by the feeling that nothing can be done to solve our problems. The truth is, I do not know why this bad spirit and others like it continue to take hold of some lives, sometimes very aggressively. Jesus never explains why there is evil, why there are things that detract from the wholeness and abundant life God intends. He simply acknowledges it as a reality on this earth, teaches us to pray and act against it, and shows us through his resurrection that in the end, God does and will triumph over all the forces of death in their various shapes and forms. As Bishop Desmond Tutu says, our Christian hope in a world that is still very much marred by bad spirits is that goodness is stronger than evil, love is stronger than hate, light is stronger than darkness, and victory is ours through him who loves us. But there is much about this journey through God's time and our lives that remains a mystery. Evil, defined as that which steals, destroys, or kills that which is of great value to God, especially life and the image of God within us. That force that wants to steal and destroy is still with us. Thankfully, so is the risen Christ. To close, I would like to share a story that helped me reorient to the awesomeness of God this week, even in the midst of the shadows, that helped me open my eyes to the continued miracles of the risen Christ, multiplying loaves and casting out some of the demons in our midst, with help from those who have decided to respond to his authority, to his teachings, with the intention of following him and seeking to walk in his ways, even as we do so very imperfectly. Back in September, as kids went back to school without classrooms, and Colin and I began to oversee the online learning of our own two children, we began to feel as pastors that there was a hurt we could not see directly, but could intuit easily with our minds. There was a danger, not to our own lives, but to the emotional, social, and intellectual lives of every child whose parents could not actively support their online learning due to work schedules or other constraints. As a mother, I knew how much effort and time was involved in keeping my first and fourth grader on task and on track. I knew not every child had adults who could help them in this way at home. I felt Christ calling me to lean into the honorific title the tradition of this church sometimes bestows on me, to somehow mother the children of the congregation in this time of pandemic education. I imagined in prayer children learning and shepherded in our sanctuary. Our leadership team all agreed it was worthwhile, essential. We didn't know how exactly we would do it, but we knew we had to do it or try. Jesus' teaching was upon us. I think one of the reasons we often don't recognize modern miracles is because in real life, the timing seems off. The St. Luke's Learning Pod didn't blossom overnight. It took what felt like forever to get off the ground, each week feeling like an eternity, because we knew that kids were trapped behind screens, alone, losing ground. When we first started, we were given the gift of 2 solid volunteers and 1 on-the-ground staff member. I felt like the disciples in the feeding of the 5,000. 2 volunteers, Jesus, 1 staff member. We can't feed all these people with this. At that time, we could only offer the pod 2 days a week. But on the first day in early November, we gave thanks to God and said it was good anyway. The kids asked if they could come every day. This past week was the 3rd full week that the Learning Pod has been in operation 5 days a week, with now 20 students, 4 staff members, and 2 volunteers. The kids get breakfast, lunch, snacks, support for their learning, and social time, in masks, but also, more importantly, in person. I was congratulating one student on his good grades when I saw him on Tuesday, and he surprised me, shocked me, put me in a state of awe when he said back quickly, "Thanks to this place." A small miracle of uninvited thanksgiving, a small glimpse of transformation. One commentary on demon possession says the most important thing to connect with in this gospel story is that this person is being rescued from an impossible bondage. That is what it feels like to have a bad spirit, a demon. This is what we hear from people who are themselves feeling gripped by and then freed from addictions. I couldn't shake this language from my head as I talked over the Learning Pod with other staff and students about their experience. Over and over, I heard from the staff these sorts of things. I just see so clearly that at home, alone with their computers, without movement, without connection, learning would be impossible. Another said, it's hard to keep them on task with their learning, but we can do it. But at home, on their own, it would be impossible. Do you hear it? This is the work of rescuing kids from impossible bondage, impossible requirements of them on their own. Now, I'm not saying online learning is a demon. It was the best we could do, especially early in the pandemic. But anyone who has been close to it knows that it brings with it plenty of bad spirits. One teen, whom I've known and watched grow at St. Luke's for the past few years, spoke softly about the difference between before and after the Learning Pod. Before, she said, I was just in my bed all day. I would stay up late and sleep in late. It's just so good to get out of the house. Now, she said, I go to bed early and get up early. When I congratulated her on her recent good grades, she said, thank you, then paused and smiled. I even turn my camera on now, she said. Her beautiful glance struck my heart with awe. The image of God in her not hidden, not obscured in darkness and isolation in her bedroom, but felt, known, seen. Camera clicked on. The voices that say God has nothing to do with her, silenced. Get out, Jesus commands. The shadows flee. We stand, we sit, we participate with awe and gratitude. We see the wonders of this gospel and of Psalm 111 anew. We are amazed. We try to follow. And so we might live to see another miracle. If our hearts are not hardened, if we can look upon what God has already given us and done amongst us with awe.